Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you is the growing drama around monkeypox, or as it is now called, Mpox. A virus outbreak is hitting Europe after spreading from Brazil, and it's raising all kinds of red flags. One fluid may be responsible for protecting a number of your organs, and its failure can be incredibly drastic. Incredibly dumb advertising around treating hypertension and the absolutely stupid misunderstandings associated therewith. Keto diets are definitely a high-risk strategy and not worth that risk. DNA from lost European princes may solve a conspiracy. Gene editing of vegetables to increase consumption of fruits and vegetables. Flamingos in a UK zoo hatch a chick, noting that they are same-sex flamingos, which raises more questions than it does answers. The experience of a reviewer for a questionable publisher called NDPI. The consequences of trying to use filters in a conference, particularly one aimed at paleontology, and the kind of ridiculous shenanigans it led to. A bad study about the various skin colors of people and the nonsense claims therein. A rather amazing image taken of the sun, but not how or why you might imagine. And of course, proof, at least further proof, that astrology does not work. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's begin with the joy and happiness that is monkeypox. We have two bits of news. The first is the rather unexpected, well, not really, it's in fact incredibly expected, announcement from the World Health Organization that it is now a global public health emergency. This shouldn't come as a surprise. Simply put, it's been spreading. It's just not as deadly as, well, let's say COVID-19 is, nor is it as impactful on the entirety of the global population. As a result, it has gradually snuck under the radar, just like a virus in Plague Inc. All we're waiting for now is the sudden and very unwanted switch from a rather subtle and frustrating disease to a deadly disease. The other reason it's, let's say, not being advertised as widely is the individuals who are mostly likely to be infected, this being gay and bisexual males. Now, this is also one reason why they changed it from monkeypox to Mpox. But that aside, it's a relatively small area, and they've been targeting all attempts to deal with it primarily at individuals who are at high risk. As such, they're trying to do the right thing by focusing resources and not making a massive mountain out of a molehill. But that's not really working, and given that there is a roughly 3 to 5% fatality rate, understandably, they should probably not have been doing that. This gets worse now when we have a new clade, and this new clade is the concern here. It is relatively more lethal, and that's the concern here. Not only is it more lethal, but it's also more infectious, and that's a combination you don't want. You can handle infectious agents to an extent, primarily condoms, but you can't really handle infectious and deadly, because there's not a lot to be done about the deadly side of things. And that is the problem here. The problem right now is that the announcement from the World Health Organization does put this on the same level as things like COVID-19, the Ebola outbreaks, H1N1 in 2009, and several other diseases. So there is some concern about whether or not the World Health Organization is not necessarily overhyping what it is, but classifying it incorrectly, at least relative to other diseases. At the same time, some of this concern is not unwarranted, and, for example, we have the CDC declaring monkeypox a continental emergency. This comes hand in hand with the World Health Organization's announcement, and it is fundamentally the same issues. That is, it's spreading, It's not going away, and unfortunately treatment doesn't seem to be putting much of a dent in its spread, and certainly its fatality rate. And then of course there is the spread of different clades. Now we've spoken about one already, that's one primarily seen in Africa, but there's another that's in other parts of the world, and so now we have two problems to face. The clade 2 seems to be less dangerous with a lower fatality rate, but this also means there's a much higher chance that individuals will wind up spreading it. The other does have a significantly higher fatality rate, somewhere up to 5%. Now that is a worry. There's also the fact that a disproportionate, we're talking about 10% of individuals, are completely asymptomatic. This makes them excellent plague carriers, and Papa Nurgle would be overjoyed by them. Not just because they're incredibly effective at carrying the plague and thereby incubating it, but then spreading it. Yes, the grandfather is giving out his gifts of disease. Grandfather Nurgle would not just be overjoyed by monkeypox though. There are other diseases that are spreading, let's say. And of course, the next story is going to be in California, where individuals unwittingly managed to get themselves infected during a festival. How did this happen, you might wonder? It's uncomfortably simple. The festival goers kicked up the dust, and the dust happened to be filled with spores, and these spores were a dangerous fungi that then managed to infect their lungs. And now we have all sorts of people being infected with the fungus called Coccidioides fungi. It's otherwise called valley fever. The California Department of Public Health has grave concerns that there are even more cases that have been undiagnosed. Not just because in America, being diagnosed will cost you, and possibly that cost might be the equivalent of having to sell a kidney on the black market, and if you're really unlucky, bankruptcy. But this does mean that the 20,000 individuals who went there have a fairly high chance of having been infected. That's 20,000 cases from one event. That's a huge number, and of course that's a problem, because you need to be prepared to deal with it, and there are very few health services that are prepared for a sudden surge of so many patients needing treatment for something very specific and narrow. There is arguably an interesting further development to this, and it's at least a theoretical explanation as to why there is such widespread infection, and it comes down to this. There was initially a great deal of rain causing flooding, and of course fungi like a nice moist environment, unlike people who don't like the word moist. As such, it grew and grew and grew, and then there was a dry period, effectively a drought, and this is attributed to climate change. This led to the spores being stored in the ground as dust, and then we have the concert. Now you don't necessarily need climate change for these series of events, but it would significantly contribute to it, thereby leading to the fun and games that will be the California Health Service trying to juggle this over the coming weeks and months, if not possibly years. Shifting from America and infectious diseases there, we get to go to Europe and Brazil, where we have warnings about a particular disease called Oropouche virus. This virus is all kinds of fun because it's a largely virus borne by arthropods. This means that it can be transmitted by mosquitoes and similar biting insects, which is just wonderful. It's the same sort of issues around, say, dengue or yellow fever, even malaria if we're talking about parasites, all sorts of things that you just don't want infecting you, and yet here we have it happening. So we have, first of all, at least 19 cases in Europe, which is not good, but also deaths in South America. So this is now 2 major continents, admittedly one of them with a somewhat more significantly developed healthcare system than the other, but that's not the point. The point is, it's spreading internationally and killing people, on top of infecting them, obviously. And this is one more pain to add to the bite of mosquitoes. On average, infections are not going to kill people, but as with any disease, there are outliers. And unfortunately, the outliers in this case involve things like encephalitis and meningitis. Encephalitis is when you have swelling around the brain, causing it to basically be compressed, and well, the brain doesn't do well when compressed. Yes, some people just don't have a brain and therefore they may not notice the difference, but for most people, they will. Meningitis involves inflammation of a layer in the brain that again can lead to similar issues. And of course, you can have the most drastic of scenarios called hemorrhage, that is blood on the brain, and this has a similar effect to the other two, except, well, blood, which means both a lack of oxygen and nutrition, but also pressure. So you get two things you don't want, rather than just one. If you're now thinking, wow, the world sounds truly terrifying, I don't want to deal with this unless there's something where I can get treated with. And, well, for some of these, there is vaccines. But anti-vaxxers have basically made those taboo in some areas, because those people are idiots and think that they cause autism and all sorts of other things. They don't, by the way. And here's something that gets interesting. Those same people will cite this, that, and the other, oftentimes YouTube videos, ironically enough, and say that, well, here's your proof. But no, it doesn't, because a lot of the times it's arguments like, oh, there's thimerosal, or as they call it, mercury in vaccines. In most cases, no. Or that they cause autism, which, again, no. Without really considering the opposite side of things, and this is where an interesting report from the CDC is kind of helpful. In the last 30 years, childhood vaccination regimes have, at least according to this report, prevented more than 500 million illnesses and 1 million deaths in the USA. That's not an insignificant number, and when you consider that there's a decent probability that a child would either be one of those 500 million infections and or one of those 1 million deaths, the very, very, very low risk of your child being diagnosed with autism independently of vaccines isn't really much of a deterrent. And it's why the report is so interesting and useful. It not just shows that vaccines work, and they are beneficial, but how damn important they are. And more so when you have more recent vaccines, like that for rhinosinusitis virus or RSV, and COVID-19, and both of which do have an effect on children. COVID-19, admittedly, we're still catching up on the data for, but RSV is very well known. So stopping either, if not preferably both, is good. Unless you're an anti-vaxxer, in which case this data is probably going to be something where you scream and rail and rant and scream it's just not true, or it's a big pharma shill, or the government is hiding the truth, or some other nonsense. In which case, please keep walking and go find yourself a nice tinfoil hat to wear, and no doubt choosing one from your wide collection. Going from picking on the anti-vaxxers to a interesting explanation of what goes on with cerebrospinal fluid and how it's so very important in protecting primarily your brain, but also your spinal cord, rather obviously given its name. Cerebrospinal fluid is, for all intents and purposes, a clear liquid that is involved in moving nutrients into and out of your brain and spinal cord. It provides all the necessary ions for neuron activity. It removes waste once those neurons are done working and more. And for all of that, it's perhaps something that's not all that well understood by most people. It's understood where it is and to an extent what it does, but not really how significant that can be. Particularly if you begin to, say, get leaks, like what happens with meninges when they get inflamed. This leads to, well, the previously mentioned issues, particularly around meningitis, but also other issues around the brain being compressed unexpectedly and certainly in a way that's unwanted. In other cases, it can be contributing to what's called idiopathic intracranial hypertension, and for some people this is quite literally a pain in the head. It's a kind of headache. And, well, again, being a pain, you don't particularly want it, most of the time. There are some unique individuals who might find it enjoyable, for their own unique reasons. In news that's related to individual choice, we have cannabis use, and a link to cancer. Now this is going to likely trigger some of the more alternative or a liberal crowd, but deal with it. The problem here is that there is a link, and understand this is a tenuous link based on issues around observation and whatnot, so take that with a significant amount of salt. But it is found that smoking weed on a regular basis, and particularly as an alternative to tobacco or alcohol consumption, may increase your risk of cancer. Now, the cancers that you are at risk of include head, neck, oral, oropharyngeal, nasopharyngeal, salivatory gland, and laryngeal cancers. Now, these aren't going to be a surprise. Simply put, not only are you breathing in a smoke, typically speaking, or similar, which will cause not only heat, but to a certain extent aggravated damage to the respiratory pathway, but there are other issues around the drug itself, particularly the active compounds in cannabis. As a result, finding there's an increase in cancer isn't that surprising. It's the same issues you would have if you were exposed to, say, smoke as a firefighter, or tobacco consumption, and possibly, and very likely in the near future, to be identified with vaping. So, yeah, this one's not really that surprising. It is important to note that while we do mock it for being observational, it is a large study over 20 years, or large-ish for what it is anyway. It's about 120,000 individuals whose clinical records were tracked over 20 years, and they're able to develop their associative model, which was cannabis use equals these cancers. So again, not all that surprising. We will state, and it's worth pointing out, that the relative risk, and it's key to point this out, relative risk for cannabis versus something like alcohol does put alcohol in a higher risk category, which, again, shouldn't be that surprising, given various factors. But nonetheless, it is worth being aware of. Next we have what is an example of human stupidity, and how you can treat hypertension. Mind you, this treatment at no point includes things like statins, diuretics, beta blockers, or anything similar, which is a problem. What they instead suggest is a variety of herbal supplements, cleansers, and similar. No. These things may make you feel better in terms of emotionally you're doing the right thing and you're going all natural, but in practice they do nothing and put you in a high-risk category for having a cardiovascular event, whether that is a stroke, heart attack, some sort of aneurysm, and so on. These are bad. In no way, shape, or form is any herbal remedy ever going to be a replacement for actual medication, something that works, because they don't. And we can only better demonstrate this with social media influencers encouraging people to use fecal face masks. These individuals, who at least follow this practice, are likely to find themselves experiencing the joy of a second dinner when it comes back up the other way, and likely a severe case of diarrhea, because they're going to give themselves food poisoning. It's called the fecal oral route, and the name should tell you everything about it. It's literally poop going into your mouth, and then causing issues around food poisoning. Typically, what happens is somebody doesn't wash their hands very well, handles food, and then proceeds to eat said food without cooking it thoroughly. Therefore, the poop particles get into their body. The fact that these individuals have completely dropped the middle step of preparing food and just gone straight to smear it on their face is kind of terrifying and dumb. Humanity is doomed. Either the aliens are going to destroy us, or we're going to make a damn good run of doing it before they arrive. In other dieting news, we have the keto diet, and what is already a nonsensical diet in every instance except possibly diabetes and childhood epilepsy. Keto diabetes is nonsense, and now we have evidence showing not only is it nonsense, but arguably it actually presents other issues that may put it into a higher risk category. The problem is simple. The microbiome within your GI tract is already fairly well developed, given most people grow up well before going on a ketogenic diet, and as such, it's developed, let's say, to consume a wide range of different kinds of food sources, mostly speaking, not protein. Therefore, the keto diet does not provide these microbes what they need, and as such, they can't make up what you need in your body. I'm not just talking here about something like vitamins and nutrients. Rather, we're talking about the actual ability of these bacteria to survive and ensure you don't get sudden influxes, like with face masks made out of feces, or from pathogenic bacteria that get the opportunity, causing you to become ill. In fact, it does present other issues, particularly around a notable increase in the amount of cholesterol and other undesirable fats in your body and the way they circulate around in your bloodstream. In other nonsensical diet news, we have an article claiming that they figured out where gluten intolerance begins from. We can tell you that without having to do any research, and that is people's imagination. Gluten intolerance doesn't exist. It is an imaginary term used by people who think they get ill from gluten without being allergic to gluten. The problem is, that's not actually a gluten allergy. Now, there is a possibility, and this is substantiated by some other research we've touched on in the past, that gluten intolerance is actually not related to gluten at all. Gluten itself will be found in many of the products, and particularly plant matter that has these other things in it, but it's not the gluten itself that is causing the problem. And so, when people say they're gluten intolerant, what they really mean is, I'm intolerant to something else found alongside gluten, which is a complete misnomer. Frustratingly, it seems that even the researchers themselves are conflating gluten allergies, that is celiac disease for instance, with gluten intolerance. And therein lies the fundamental issue here. All of the discussion in the article about the research talks about it in terms of the allergy, not the intolerance, and that's a big and very different story. Shifting to genetics and very old news, particularly around a 200-year-old conspiracy theory. It's arguing that there is a lost prince that has, been somewhat answered through genetic testing. A boy was found in 1828, and it was claimed that he had been kept in a dungeon, held captive. The feral child, as he was called, couldn't speak, but used the name Caspar Hauser. The theory is that he was, theoretically at least, the child of the Grand Duke Karl, and used to be a prince in Baden territory in South Germany. This all sounds well and good, except that kid was supposed to be dead in 1812. That raises problems. This brings an interesting approach to the problem. Historically, attempts to do this have relied on techniques that don't necessarily cope well, particularly with highly degraded DNA. With developments in forensic technology and, genetic technology full stop, different approaches are both able to work with smaller sequences and, importantly, mitochondrial DNA, which is where this study focused. Their theory was, if we can get matching DNA from various sources of the crimes, for instance, the hair and relatives, we can figure out what's going on. And importantly, they can compare mitochondrial DNA. This would tell us something about the mother and child relationship. If we can prove that there is a relationship, great, you know they're their kid. Except that's not what they found, and therein lies the problem. It clearly shows, at least at this stage, that there isn't a lineage related to the House of Baden. Next we go to another development related to genetics, but rather than humans, plants, and importantly the humble potato. The potatoes, whether you boil, mash them, fry them, or turn them into a stew, are useful, but by themselves they're not really a complete meal. And this is where an Israeli startup is intending to try and increase the amount of protein content in potatoes. Now, part of this is simply to make them more palatable, but part is to increase their value as a food. Potatoes do make up a fairly large part of a lot of different diets across the world, and as such, improving their nutritional value would be a good thing. There is, however, two fairly major points to make about this. First, what they're intending to do with these potatoes is not use them in terms of human consumption. What they want is to use them for animal feed, which does make a certain amount of sense. The potato may not necessarily be a great thing for humans, but it's a far more complete animal feed for, say, cattle. But the other thing is, they describe it as close to animal proteins such as, presumably, egg albumin and casein, which is a major question. What do they mean by close to? Close to is not necessarily the same as. In fact, there can be a very big gap between, and that big gap is a not only big question, but a major concern. In other genetically modified crop news, we have another company looking to modify, in this case, fruits and vegetables to make them more palatable and thereby increase dietary intake of these. The questionable approach is primarily targeting leafy greens, so think of things like your lettuce, the kale if you're so inclined to hate food, cabbages, and so on. All of these are targets to make them more palatable to be consumed, and by making them, more edible, people will be more likely to consume them, and because of this, they should get a better diet, at least a more balanced diet. This is certainly not the first time it's happened. For example, a lot of people don't like Brussels sprouts, and they claim that they're incredibly bitter and unpalatable, which may have been true a very long time ago. But since the 90s, they've been selling particular varieties of the Brussels sprouts that have had the bitterness drastically reduced, thereby making them taste somewhat sweeter and certainly less bitter, thereby at least somewhat more desirable to eat. Now, we maintain the argument that technically a beer is a complete meal, mostly because you have your sugars, you have your carbohydrates, and you have your protein. Protein from yeast, you have your sugars that have been extracted from your grains, and of course you have the grains themselves. Therefore, you get all three of the requisite food groups, except possibly for fats. But that's a different matter. And now for animal news, and something coming out of the UK that would have Steve Irwin turning like he was in a crocodile death roll. A renowned British crocodile expert has been jailed for 10 years and 5 months in Australia, which is an irony given that that's where Britain sends all of their convicts, after admitting to sexually abusing dogs. Why would you do that to the good boy? Why? This idiot pled guilty to 56 charges. How the hell do you do this 56 times? Of course, it's not the only abuse that he was charged with in this case. There were also 4 counts of child-related material. Yeah. So, apparently UK is no longer sending their best and brightest convicts to Australia, but their worst of kind. And apparently conduct that lasted over 2 decades. Apparently, a PhD in zoology leads to a, honestly, quite bizarre and horrifying fascination with animals, but particularly dogs. It's a shame that at no point did any of the dogs, which apparently most of whom died, bite him and solve this issue for everybody. In other news from the BBC, and this time still related to animals but more confusing than anything, a pair of same-sex flamingos has successfully hatched an egg at the Devon Zoo. This is all well and good. The flamingos are doing what they do. They're reproducing. And so, That's great. The question is, how did they get the egg, since nobody seems to know where it came from? One theory is that they took the egg that was abandoned by another flamingo couple, and maintained it for as long as was needed to hatch it. Which, okay, that's all well and good, but they stole someone else's egg, or at least picked it up randomly. That's a really worrying behavior, or at least it's worrying enough to be worth interesting and investigating to get more details about to see whether or not this is common. Shifting to education-related news, but specifically looking at immigration for students who are looking to study abroad. The article from Bloomberg particularly focuses on the UK, Netherlands, Canada, and Australia, all of which have tightened their requirements to be able to, immigrate. And, in doing so, they have created issues. One of the major issues is simply that, a lot of international students pay very high fees to attend those universities, and as such, those universities don't have that money coming in, due to a government decision. The other side to this is that a lot of people are screaming that this is all politics, and that the decision is one of government, signaling to the populace, rather than an actual legitimate thing going on. We think that this is perhaps part of it, and there would be a lot of theory crafting involved to go into detail, so we won't, but for now, we don't think it's necessarily the case that it's just postulating on the part of governments. There is arguably a certain issue around particularly graduate students and espionage, let's say, but also around the ability to simply pay for your stay in a country given the currency conversion rates, particularly at the moment the cost of living and so on. Therefore, a lot of people just can't afford to move. On the other hand, a lot of people are just being rejected because government assholes. In other academic news, we have an interesting interview with an individual who was a reviewer for NDPI. Now, a reviewer is somebody who, unsurprisingly, reviews things. But NDPI, if you aren't aware, is one of the journals out there. More accurately, they're a publishing house that owns a number of different journals who, have a very bad reputation. And so being a reviewer for them could theoretically be great. That's because you could start building up your resume saying, I reviewed for X, Y, and Z journal. But if you're working for a journal that's questionable, probably not as helpful. And particularly around, companies like NDPI. The way the Predator Journal field works in a very broad sense is you submit a journal article and the editorial service, typically speaking, will take your payment and your article, process it ever so slightly, and then host it on their website. Now, better services will still operate on a similar basis, except there will actually be a certain amount of peer review process, so it does take longer. And that's the category in which this is found. This article goes through the example of a particular article that, despite being rejected twice already, got published the third time round. And the third time had already taken it back to the original version that had been rejected outright for massive issues with not only the methodology, but the actual content contained within it. For example, the claim that it was prospectively collected data, that is, data collected before you actually began, doing anything with it. So, for instance, you want to run an experiment, you get your approval, you set up your method, then you do the experiment. That's prospective data collection. What they appear to have done is, quite simply a retrospective analysis, and that's supported by a lot of the other things that are contained within their method section. Further to that, you have mismatches between the sample size, the number of participants, and all sorts of other things that indicate the data is certainly not, we wouldn't say legitimate, but there are a lot of flags that need to be asked about it, and especially when you look at the sheer number of t-tests run and the probability of type 1 errors, let alone the probability of p-hacking. As such, NDPI has not made itself look well, especially when you consider that they already have a rather bad reputation. In other academic news, we have to talk about the prospective shortage of academics in the coming future, and particularly around researchers involved primarily in plant breeding. This is an article coming out of Australia's research peak body, and it's making the case that, particularly going into the future and as more of the current generation of plant scientists goes into retirement, there's no one to fill that gap, and that gap is getting bigger. And with the importance of food growing, particularly with food that's not able to survive in a more hostile environment, we need them to do so. Of course, it's not just that we need new technology in terms of food. We need to be able to use that technology, and that's something that humanity's really not very good at. To use a simple example, we have a paleontology conference that decided to use a profanity filter. Now, this sounds all well and good. You obviously want to reduce the possibility of people being rude, particularly in what could possibly be an international event. The problem is, the terms that they included to ban were things like pubic, bone, and stream. Now, independently, none of these are particularly bad words. There's nothing particularly offensive about bone, pubic, or stream. But in conjunction with other words or in certain contexts, sure, you could possibly make a case for it. When you're at a paleontology conference, where you tend to find things in streams, where you talk about bones, and particularly things like pubic bones, kind of not wanting to ban those, because it gets in the way of all sorts of discussion, and discussion that is legitimate. Such that, well, the organisers had to do what anybody who's ever played an online game recently has had to do, and that is find workarounds, coded language, and so on. Which just demonstrates that how dumb things can be and how badly humans can use technology. The science itself isn't squeaky clean though, and well, we've already mentioned some of the issues around peer-reviewed publishing and, well, publishing in general, but there's another issue here coming out of the firebreak, and although we don't agree with all the points, it does raise some decent arguments in some ways. For example, issues around the conflicts of interest, and the fact that they're not well expressed or stated, the funding problem, and we've spoken about that last week, and then we also have issues around the relationship between some, let's say, academics and various law firms. The article goes through a perfect example from the end of 2023, in which American Pediatrics published a bullshit article trying to link genetically modified foods with all sorts of issues, and they just couldn't be further from the truth. And they explain that, well, there are individuals involved with fundamentally trying to spur that on and make it so that the pediatric community is going to embrace it, despite the fact that the publication is bad, and bad in all kinds of ways. While we won't go through everything contained in the article, it's definitely worth a read, if only because it gives a very solid timeline of events and the issues around what was and wasn't done. Particularly important what wasn't done when it comes to the quality of the published research, and we say research very generously. The very simple summary of a somewhat out of context but very controversial statement is this image here, and what you see is that over time it would appear, at least certainly based on the questions that it's premised on and the nature of the results, that weirdly enough, white people are increasingly hating themselves, which, depending on who you ask, this may or may not be obvious, while other groups have increasingly high opinions of themselves, which, again, may or may not be surprised depending on who you ask. And it raises interesting questions about self-perception. However, the same results are derived from what are best described as feeling thermometers. And feeling thermometers aren't necessarily a great metric, It's not necessarily that they're wrong, it's just that they're not really able to be extrapolated out very well in a lot of contexts. If humanity manages to survive the shit show that is humanity, and we go to colonize other planets, there may be a reasonably easy way to make Mars more habitable. And habitable only if you're particularly fond of being sparkly. Blasting Mars with glitter as it's described. The idea is to put glitter into the Martian atmosphere, and this would help it to increase in temperature. Currently it's considerably too cold at night, being as low as -64 degrees, which for those of you who insist upon freedom units is about 85 degrees. And by putting glitter into the atmosphere, you can ensure that as much of the energy that gets into the planet and onto it remains there for as long as possible, and you can theoretically sustain a more stable temperature for a longer time frame. In a manner of speaking, it's similar to greenhouse gases, just shinier. It is very important that we point out that this solution is, first of all, not a quick fix by any stretch of the imagination. The process would take centuries at best. The second issue is that it still wouldn't make the planet habitable in terms of the necessary things like oxygen. Instead, the theory is that by making it hospitable to other life forms, particularly microbes, on the planet that don't necessarily require the same level of oxygen as a human does, you could kickstart the life process and thereby lead into the production of things like oxygen. All of this can be done with what is already on Mars, and by that we're referring to a lot of the metallic minerals that are already there, like aluminium and iron, which could theoretically be turned into the products needed for this. And next we have a really cool image. The image itself is looking at the sun. However, we're not looking at the sun by actually staring at it directly. Rather, it's an image of the sun taken at night by staring through the Earth. As the X-Post notes, staring through 8,000 miles of Earth to the other side, and by measuring the neutrinos that make their way through. It's kinda cool, if only because it's, well, completely unexpected, much like the Spanish Inquisition. Next we have the possibility of water on Mars, which takes us back to the Red Planet. But where previously we're looking at making it incredibly sparkly and silly, in this case it's looking at the other things we would need to have life there, primarily water. And it's a article claiming that a lot of the water that we would need is not necessarily contained in, say, glaciers or frozen in ice. Or rather, there's an arguable case to be made that there's a large ocean of water, at least 1 kilometer underground. This water is locked away in what could be best described as underground reservoirs, which are deep layers of ice. These layers of ice are not readily available, and certainly nowhere near accessible. But by being able to make them accessible in various ways, we could theoretically be able to have colonies there. However, there would be one big problem. We would need to have desalination plants, since all of this water is supposed to be incredibly saline, if it is true. And that's a big question, if. The final news item we have for you is also space related, but debunking a nonsensical idea. Astrology. The article has gone with a very simple approach. Take 152 astrologers and see if they could demonstrate any legitimate skill and ability. Unsurprisingly, no. You could quite literally have a cat chase a toy across a board with various things, and you'd probably have a better chance of getting an accurate depiction of what happens. If we're just going to rely on the typical nonsense of your zodiac sign says this about you today, yeah, you're not going to get much because they are shit. But the astrologers also criticized the researchers for that, so the researchers came back and said, okay, if that's how you want to play it, we'll do it your way. We'll give you an entire profile, along with 5 full astrological charts. And you now give us what you think is going to happen. And this is fundamentally the best way to approach it. They have made an Iron Man of the astronomer's argument. They haven't got the straw man, they have built the strongest case for the astronomers to get exactly what they need, and get as much information as they need, within reason. It was 43 personal questions to identify things about the individual, and then they had to predict what would happen. The researchers then set it up in such a way that the astrologers needed to match the various charts with everything else. Now, if they randomly guessed it, they get about 3 out of every 12 questions right, and that's just if they randomly answered them. And by contrast, if they were to actually have a reliable system in place, they need just over 3. So we're talking about a quarter of all questions being accurately responded to, which isn't actually all that great. And guess what the average was? And sadly, if you've guessed 0, you're wrong, but it would have been perhaps a more reliable guess. No, it was 1% higher than if they had been randomly guessing. 1% higher. Now, the overall rate, let's say, was slightly higher again, at 3% higher than randomly guessing. But nonetheless, that's still an insignificant difference from them just throwing darts at a board. In fact, no astrologer could get more than 5 out of the 12 profiles they were given to correctly match to an individual. This means that there isn't even a coin flip that they're going to get it right. It even gets worse again when you consider that if a coin flip is more reliable than an astrologer in telling what's happening, perhaps you're just not seeing the right astrologer. And this is the other issue. It seems that the agreement within astrologers for the same thing differs drastically, and as such, even if you have an astrologer that you think is better, they're honestly no more so than anyone else, for exactly the same reason. You just can't get congruity between them. There's a great deal more detail found in the article, and it's a good read. If for nothing else, then it's kind of hilarious. And you'll find it linked below in the description box. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.